preaching biblical Christianity to third world nations.
God spoke to the void, and the universe showed up. Our universe contains about 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. There are over 100 parameters that had to be precisely, exactly so, for life to exist on our planet. But of course, life does exist, created and sustained by God. Today, there are almost 6.5 billion people in our world. Our cultures vary, yet we share the same miracle, life. The human body is the pinnacle of God's creative genius. Today, science strives to learn more about our past in order to create a better future. Yet as scientists discover what God already knows, the details of a grand design begin to emerge. We should not fear science. God invented science. A clear understanding of what He has done only enhances our view of Him. God's power is undeniable. His precision is impressive. His sovereignty is on display. How can such power fail to dominate our every thought and action, to rescue us from our everyday insecurities? It is not that God has failed to demonstrate His nature. It is just that we are slow to understand. What we need is a new vision of God, the real God. More Than Meets the Eye is a 4-part video series demonstrating a God who is brilliant and wise, powerful and precise, intimate and personal. The more we understand about God's power, the less we worry about our weakness. Richard Swenson, MD, is a physician, futurist, best-selling author, and award-winning educator. He has researched the material you are about to see, and his insight has become his passion. In 2003, the Christian Medical and Dental Associations honored Dr. Swenson with the Educator of the Year award. Dr. Swenson has traveled to over 50 countries for purposes of speaking, practice, or study. He has presented to a wide variety of career, professional, educational, medical, governmental, and management groups, including the Mayo Clinic, the Pentagon, members of the United Nations, and members of Congress. Dr. Swenson is author of 6 books, including More Than Meets the Eye.
We've been exploring together the magnificence of God. In our first session, we saw how the human body is a reflection of the brilliance and genius, the power, the precision, the sophistication of an almighty creator. We are not only created in His image, but we're also crowned with glory and honor, fearfully and wonderfully made. We have 10 to the 28th atoms in the human body, more than there are stars in the universe. And we turn over 1 trillion atoms every 1/1,000,000th of a second. When we examine the subatomic space, we find that we are perhaps infinite in the subatomic direction. Superstrings lurking down there in the subatomic space are 100 million billion times smaller than a proton. Our heart beats 2.5 billion times in a lifetime and pumps blood over 60,000 miles of blood vessels. We make 2 million red blood cells every second. And if you put them side by side by side, they would circle the earth at the equator 4 times. In our lungs, at any given moment, we have 150 million air molecules breathed by Jesus, the exact, precise, same ones. What the retina of the eye does every 1/3 of a second would take a supercomputer 100 years to do. The ear has 1 million moving parts and in many ways is even more sensitive than the eye. The human brain at a mere 3 pounds is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe. Your nervous tissue, if stretched out, would reach 100,000 miles. The brain stores the equivalent of 25 million books and can function at 10,000 trillion computations per second. Perhaps the most amazing is the human genome and the DNA. We have 100 trillion cells in our body, and each cell has DNA in its chromosomes. The DNA from one cell is 6 feet long. If we stretched it all out, it would reach 100 billion miles. The DNA from just your body, laid end to end, would reach 100 billion miles. The initial single-cell DNA of every human being alive today, every human being, all 6 billion alive today, at one point were only one cell. If you took the initial single-cell DNA from all 6 billion people and weighed it together, it would total 1/1000th of an ounce. Do we have any idea the level of power and precision that we are dealing with here? What we need is a new vision of God, the real God, not some vague image we fold up and stuff in the back drawer of life, but the kind of God who parts the Red Sea and who shakes Mount Sinai, the kind of God who stuns the physicists with symmetry, the mathematicians with precision, the engineers with design, the politicians with power, and the poets with beauty. Don't fear science. God invented it all, and a clear understanding of what he has done only enhances our view of him. I want to talk specifically for a minute to the non-scientists who are listening. Many people had trouble with chemistry in 7th grade, and they vowed right then they're never going back. It was just too painful. I understand the feeling. But I intentionally wish to make this material accessible to people who are afraid of science, who think of science as an enemy. After all, we all should have an opportunity to enjoy this spiritual encouragement. Our topic for this session is the new physics. Sir Isaac Newton was a brilliant scientist. Some people think perhaps the most brilliant man that ever lived. I think his only competition for that title would be Einstein himself. Newton was born in 1642. He died 85 years later. His life and work changed the world of science as few people before him or after him. He invented the calculus system of mathematics. He derived his universal law of gravitation, a law that kept the planets in orbit and even ruled the entire universe. As a result and a consequence of Newton's work, in 1900, the Newtonian worldview ruled. According to the Newtonian worldview, everything was mechanistic. There was a formula. Everything was reduced to equations. Almost all the work, as a matter of fact, was already done. And in 1900, physicists started thinking of looking for other lines of work. But then came along a man named Albert, and he shook the entire scientific world by the cranium. He rearranged all our synapses, and we haven't even yet begun to recover from what Albert Einstein did to us. As a result, the Einstein worldview has ruled over the last 100 years. At first, because of the radical change in Einstein's theories and his research, many theologians were shaken. However, today, virtually everything that he has uncovered and suggested are theologically interesting. One noted physicist named Robert Griffiths commented, "If we need an atheist for a debate, I go to the philosophy department. The physics department isn't much use." Let's take a look for a minute at the person of Albert Einstein. Time magazine named him the person of the century. It was an appropriate choice. He was born in Germany. He left Germany to complete his studies in Switzerland. He forsook his German citizenship because of their militaristic ways that he disagreed with. This, of course, was long before Nazi Germany came in. He finished his degree in Switzerland. He sent out resumes across Europe trying to get employment. Nobody would hire him. You know why? Because he acted like he was arrogant, like he knew more than they did. Well, it turns out he did. And so in 1905, he takes a job as a patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland. He was underemployed, the very definition of underemployment. He's poor, underemployed, estranged from the world, without a country, rejected by Europe's academic establishment, stung by his parents' disdain for his older Serbian wife. And there he is sitting in Bern, Switzerland, on a stool looking at a wall most of the time. And yet in one miraculous year, 1905, at the age of 26, he published 5 papers that changed our fundamental understanding of physics forever. Any one of these papers dealing with such topics as time, space, light, energy, speed, relativity, the formula E = mc squared, any one of these papers would have secured his place in history and his reputation forever. One paper won him the Nobel Prize, and it wasn't his relativity paper. How does a brain overturn firmly entrenched paradigms with impossibly complex levels of abstract thought that have nothing to do with measurable day-to-day experience? The level of genius, one observer said, is practically incomprehensible. Yet I celebrate not so much Einstein's brain as the God who could design a brain that could think at this kind of level. Einstein later wrote about religion, quote, "The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Whoever does not know it and can no longer wonder, no longer marvel, is as good as dead, and his eyes are dimmed. It was the experience of mystery, even mixed with fear, that engendered religion, a knowledge of the existence of something we cannot penetrate, our perceptions of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which only in their more primitive forms are accessible to our minds. It is this knowledge and this emotion that constitute true religiosity. In this sense, I am a deeply religious man. I'm satisfied with the mystery of life's eternity and with the knowledge, a sense of the marvelous structure of existence, as well as the humble attempt to understand even a tiny portion of the reason with a capital R that manifests itself in nature." As we look at the new physics, we could talk about relativity, quantum mechanics, the 4 fundamental forces of physics. I mean, why are there 4? Why aren't there 2? Why aren't there 8? Why aren't there 38? We really don't know, but there's 4. We could talk about superstrings, about fission and fusion, about antimatter. But for this session, we're going to focus on Einstein's relativity. Einstein's relativity taught us that time, space, and light were not what we thought them to be. After relativity emerged, all of physics, even all of reality, was open for redefinition. At the speed of light, if you were to accelerate, for example, a ruler at the speed of light, as it's going faster and faster and approaching the speed of light, when it gets close to the speed of light, the dimension in which it's accelerating starts shrinking, and at the speed of light, the dimension goes to 0. However, the mass goes to infinity, and when it hits the speed of light, time stands still. Another formula that fell out of relativity, E = mc squared. We already mentioned that, the most famous scientific formula in the entire world. Einstein said that energy and mass are the same things, just different forms of the same things. And if you want to convert energy to mass or mass to energy, he gave us a formula. To convert mass to energy, you multiply it by the speed of light squared. Now, this shirt button has a certain amount of energy and mass associated with it. The mass, obviously, is very little. But if you want to take the pure amount of energy inherent in a shirt button, it would be enough to put the space shuttle into orbit. It would be enough to power New York City for a day. Now think about the total universe, which weighs 10 to the 50th tons. Convert that mass to energy. Do we have any idea what kind of power we're dealing with? Let's look at this special triad now, the triad of relativity: space, time, and light. First, space. We all know that we have three spatial dimensions. You can go forward and backwards, you can go up and down, you can go right and left. Three spatial dimensions. Why don't we have like 5? Why don't we have 2? Why don't we have 8? We have no idea. When the universe showed up, 3 spatial dimensions showed up with it. Now, let's talk a little bit about superstrings. Time and space, by the way, are linked. Einstein says you cannot move in space without moving in time. You cannot move in time without moving in space. So we have 3 spatial dimensions. We have 1 time dimension. We have 4-dimensional people. This is a 4-dimensional universe. As we think about superstrings, if superstrings are indeed real, and we don't know for sure that they are, but the theory of superstrings solves some fundamental problems in physics, and so there is experimental evidence and theoretical evidence that they exactly are true. They would require at least 6 additional spatial dimensions. In other words, when the universe showed up, 3 spatial dimensions manifested themselves, but there's 6 additional dimensions that are hidden, that were tied up in this very, very tiny vibrating energy packet that is 100 million billion times smaller than a proton. And some of the formulas require as much as 25 additional spatial dimensions, and possibly an extra time dimension. So it is possible when God created, actually there was a lot more mystery associated with this than what we think. Now there's an additional wrinkle on this, that some people think that these spatial dimensions are not wrapped up in these little tiny vibrating energy packets, but they are actually branes, B-R-A-N-E-S, and these branes are actually large spatial dimensions, as our spatial dimensions are, the 3 that we know and that we operate in. These other branes are there as well, maybe coexisting with us, but we're not aware of them because we don't exist in those spatial dimensions. But how about Hebrews 12, surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses? Is it possible that there is activity going on in these other spatial dimensions right now that we, in fact, are not aware of? How about space in miracles? When we understand how radically free God is from spatial dimensions, then it is easy to believe in miracles. It's even expected that there might be miracles. For example, Jesus disappearing after visiting with the men on the road to Emmaus is easy. Angels appearing and disappearing, Philip being transported away from the Ethiopian eunuch, Jesus walking on the water, Jesus appearing through locked doors is very easy once you take into account extra dimensionality. All Jesus would have to do would be occupy a 4th or a 5th spatial dimension, and it is very simple for him to perform these miracles. Such thinking might sound kind of like magic or fantasy, or things that 4th grade, 4-year-old children, maybe up 4th grade as well, would think up. But instead, this thinking is consistent with sound mathematics and physics in terms of the new physics. What about space and the afterlife? Our current creation, as wonderful and miraculous as it is, one day will end. And when that happens, God will supply us with something different, something far better. It's hard to know what kind of dimensionality this might entail. There might indeed only be 3 spatial dimensions, but there might be more. And I think whatever will greet us will include much more freedom of movement than we now enjoy. Let's talk about relativity and time. Time is a fascinating thing that Einstein introduces to. Time can seem boring. It seems like the one constant in an otherwise rapidly changing world. The seconds plod along like a steady dripping of a leaky faucet. Drip, 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 second, 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 then the minutes, then the hours, then the days. Shakespeare wrote tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. Time seems to move only in one direction. It moves forward. Aside from God himself, no person has ever been able to change the direction of that flow. And it moves at the same pace for all people. Time is a resource we all share equally. Nobody gets a minute more or a minute less, no matter how much we beg or bribe. Time just is. And then Einstein came along and he threw the rule book into the fire. Einstein proved that time only works in the usual way when we are in our routine frame of reference. Once we step outside of that frame of reference, time changes. When in the larger universe, a universe of many frames of reference and great speeds and lots of gravity, time starts to warp dramatically. There are many theological opinions about God's exact relationship with time. The Orthodox Christian position and my own belief, and consistent with the new physics, is that God indeed stands outside of time. Time was a specific invention of His. In other words, time had a beginning. God created time when He created space and matter and all the laws of physics and our universe. When our age is over, God will uninvent time, and then eternity will take over. We already looked at dimensionality, 3 spatial dimensions in 1 time dimension, but actually we don't have a full time dimension. We only have a half of a time dimension because you can only go forward. Spatial dimension, you go forward or backward. That's 1 full spatial dimension. But in time, you can only go forward. You can't go backward. Could God have given us a full time dimension? He certainly could have. He could have allowed us to go forward and backward. He decided not to. What if God gave us a full time dimension? What if God gave us 2 time dimensions? I could stop right in the middle of this sentence. I could go off in this direction in a different time dimension. I could go down to Argentina and fly fish in the Andes, and then I could go to Colorado and build a nice cabin up in the Rocky Mountains, and then I could learn to play the piano, and then I could come back here and finish my sentence, and you wouldn't even know that I was gone. Did you know that the Scripture often refers to our life as a vapor? This is another area where God is redefining time for us. I argue with God about this. I said, I've been to medical school. I'm a doctor. Life is 70 years or 80 years or 90 years or 100 years. And God says, well, it's a vapor. And I says, it is 80 years. It's 90 years. And He says, we'll talk about it again in 1 billion years. James 4 says, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Like, get a skillet and make it very hot on your stove, and then take a drop of water and drop it onto the top of that hot skillet, and you hear this little poof, and it disappears. The water disappears. And that's what James is saying our life is. I was speaking to a group of Quakers in northern Indiana. It was August. It was summer. It was hot. It was at a camp. There was an open window on the side. I was using an old Quaker overhead. And just when I was mentioning our life is a vapor, it's a mist, there was a little bug, a little mosquito or something that flew in from this window and landed on a hot element on this overhead, and it popped. And everybody heard it, and we all saw this vapor trail that lasted about 3 or 4 inches and then was gone. And I said, that's it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That's what God says our life is. David chimes in and says, the span of my years is as nothing before you. Each man's life is but a breath, in Psalm 39. Listen to what Paul has to say about this. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs them all. 2 Corinthians 4:17. Now, wait a minute, Paul. You said our momentary troubles. Why did you say that? Why did you use that word to describe your problems? As a matter of fact, your problems were interminable. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul got beat up and bruised from the beginning to the end. And then he says his troubles were momentary. God is saying to us here, I'm trying to tell you something about the temporary nature of suffering. I'm doing this for your encouragement. I'm doing this to help you get through a fallen world. It might seem to you like a long struggle, but here's a secret. Even though it feels to you that your perceptions about suffering are correct, in fact, they are not. Troubles are momentary. They are fleeting. They are vaporous. You need only to hang on for a vapor's length of time, and then you'll be home. A vapor's length of time is not too long to do what's right. Trust me. Our life is a vapor, and our troubles are a vapor. Now, we are right when we say to God that life is 80 years, and God is right when he says that life is a vapor, but God is more right than we are. Do you remember, for example, October 18th, 1992? Do you remember that day? It's kind of like a vapor, wasn't it? A vapor's length of time is not too long to hang on and do the right thing. How about time and prayer? Many people balk at prayer. They say, how can God listen to 1 million people praying at once? This is only a problem because of our dimensional blinders. Once these blinders are removed, there are no obstacles left in physics or mathematics that would prevent God from hearing 1 million prayers simultaneously. As a matter of fact, God can listen to an infinite number of prayers at the same time and take an infinite amount of time in answering each one, all within the bounds of theological and scientific orthodoxy. How about heaven? What will time be like there? We don't know exactly what God has in store for us, and we won't know until moving day arrives. But whatever it is, it will be liberating. For the first time, perhaps, we will understand God's own radical power over the time dimension. And when his majesty over the time dimension is fully displayed, we will wonder what could have been had we not so foolishly limited him during our short stay here on earth. Let me offer you some quotes about time just to provoke your thinking. Albert Einstein said this: the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only an illusion, even if a stubborn one. Now, wait a minute, Albert. Where was I 100 years ago? Where will I be 100 years from now? Where am I right now? There's no difference between those three? Brian Greene, a theoretical physicist at Columbia University, says, I don't think that the past is gone. I think that the past feels gone. There you were at a party, New Year's Eve, you were experiencing the moment. I would say that you are still experiencing that moment. There's an Irish proverb that says when God created time, he made plenty of it. Woody Allen says eternity is very long, especially near the end. St. Augustine said, what then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain what it is to him who asks me, I do not know. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, said life could only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. George Bernard Shaw said the English are not a very spiritual people, so they invented cricket to give them some idea of eternity. How about this one? This will curl your toenails. This is a NASA engineer. He said, since God's time domain is more real than ours, it is more correct to say that Christians shall all arrive in heaven at the same moment. So let's think about this for a second. My father-in-law was a godly man. He was a saint of a man. Everett Wilson departed this earth in 1995. Where is he now? Well, he is in heaven. Where am I now? I'm sitting here talking to you. But we will both arrive in heaven at the same moment. I believe that. John Newton said, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. He didn't know that's good science. How about 2 Peter 3:8? With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Let's look at light. Light is the third entry in our time, space, light trilogy. What is there about light that God showed it such favoritism? He decided to single it out for special treatment, and he gave it properties that are unequaled in the universe. Even more startling, God equated himself to light. Nothing in the created order is equal to the remarkable essence that God assigns to light. Light establishes the speed limit for the entire universe. Its speed is the only constant in the universe. It is outside of time. There have been thousands of experiments in hundreds of universities that show that photons and light are outside of time. At the speed of light, they do not age. Light never ages. It anchors the laws of relativity. It allows us to see. It comforts us with its presence and depresses us with its absence. It conveys the energy and warmth that allow us to live. It consumes darkness, but itself is never consumed by darkness, and it apparently has a divine aspect to its nature. The packets of light that the sun makes, for example, are called photons. This is what Einstein got his Nobel Prize for in his photoelectric effect paper in 1905. Photons are extraordinarily small. You see, God knew that the earth needed energy, and he knew that the sun would give the earth energy, but he had to get the energy from the sun to the earth, and so he invented photons. To give you some idea how tiny these little energy light packets are, if you shine a flashlight, coming out of that flashlight are 1,000,000 trillion photons per second, 10 to the 18th photons per second. A 100-watt light bulb has 2 times 10 to the 20th, or 200 million trillion photons per second. Every second, on the surface of the earth, every second, 1 trillion photons of light come from the sun and fall on every pinhead-sized area of the earth. 1 trillion photons every single second. All throughout the Scripture, God refers to light in a spiritual context. Let's think about Moses, for example. Remember when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and he said, God, would you show me your glory? And God says, I don't think you know what you're talking about, Moses. Nobody can look upon me and live. Moses persisted. They worked out this little agreement. God hid him in the crevice of the rock. God passed by. Moses looked and saw the glory of God. Moses comes down and his face is radiant. I don't think he was aware that his face was so radiant. He scared the people. People looked at Moses' face and ran away. And then finally, Moses figured out what it was. He put a veil over his face, and the people would come close. Then when Moses would go into the Holy of Holies, into the temple, in the tabernacle, he would take the veil off because the presence of God is there, and he'd come back out, and he'd forget to put the veil back on, and he'd scare people once again. What was it about the glory of God that caused this change on the face of Moses, this radiance? How about Paul? You know, Paul is persecuting the church, and he's going to Damascus, and all of a sudden a light comes out of the sky and knocks him over. Now, if I shine a flashlight at you, this is going to knock you over. I mean, a light knocks him over, and Paul says, who are you? What is this? And of course, it was Jesus speaking to him and converting him. I don't want this talk to be any weirder than it already is, but in terms of near-death experiences, I don't give any credibility to them. I just don't know. But every single one that I've ever read about, there is a light there. And I must confess that when I die, I fully expect to be greeted by light. Light is mentioned in the first chapter of the Old Testament. It's mentioned in the last chapter of the New Testament. How about hymns? Immortal, invisible, that great hymn. One of the verses says, Great Father of glory, pure Father of light. Thine angels adore thee, all veiling their sight. All praise we would render, oh, help us to see. 'Tis only the splendor of light hideth thee. Jesus said in John 8, I am the light of the world. In 1 John 1:5, we read, God is light. Now, God does not allow many names, many nouns to stand in for him. God is love, God is spirit, God is light. There must be something special about light. Finally, in the New Jerusalem, created as an eternal residence for the redeemed, it is marked by 2 notable absences. There is no temple and there is no sun. In a tremendous display of holy splendor, the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are both the temple and the light of the holy city. We read, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. Revelation 21. And then we read from Revelation 22, there will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light. May we all see it together. When we understand the sovereignty, the power, the design, the majesty, the precision, the genius, the intimacy and caring of an almighty God, it takes away our fear. It removes our frustration. It allows us to sleep at night and trust Him with the running of His own universe. It allows us to have margin. It allows us to resume our proper role in the order of things rather than taking over His role. It allows us to seek His will rather than follow our own mind. You see, to know Him is to trust Him. And to trust Him is to rest in Him. I want to read a few verses in closing from Psalm 116, starting in the 5th verse. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the simple-hearted. When I was in great need, He saved me. Be at rest once more, O my soul, for the Lord has been good to you.